Hello, everyone. Welcome to Nursing on the Front Lines of the Climate Crisis, Strategies for Advocacy and Action. Today is Tuesday, November 18th, and we are on session 8, and we have two wonderful speakers joining us today. We are happy to have them to join us, and I will be introducing them in a moment. But I welcome you with great pleasure to session 8. We are so pleased to be able to offer closed captioning for all of our sessions, and there is a link at the bottom of the screen. If you would like to take advantage of the closed captioning option, please click on that link. Spanish captioning is also available. Today is gender-based violence. We would also like to thank our partners and supporters, all whom have had a contribution to the planning of this course. We are grateful for all of them. We are all here today to increase our knowledge and skills and self-efficacy and improve our communication and develop improved strategies for advocacy and action related to the climate crisis. Individual attendance is automatically recorded during the live Zoom sessions, and attendance is not counted if you join with a colleague's link. The video recordings are available asynchronously on our learning platform through the Alliance of Nurses for Healthy Environments. If this is your first time accessing that learning platform, the QR code in the left is the code for you. Click on that code. You just have to set up an account, and all of our course sessions are available on the learning platform through the Alliance of Nurses for Healthy Environments. Both this course and also our previous course, Strategies, Nursing on the Front Lines of the Climate Crisis, Education for Action. So we will have by the end of today, 18 sessions available for you to view on that learning platform. If this live session does not align with your time zone, so you are able to view them asynchronously. If you have already been there, you can just use the QR code on the right of the screen, the purple QR code. Oh, or you can go to their website at learning.envirn.org. So lots of ways to access our sessions. At the end of this session, so on December 2nd, there will be eligibility for you to take the final exam, which will consist of 20 multiple choice and true-false questions. You have to take the exam in just one sitting, and it will be available on the final day of class, which is December 2nd, through December 6th, which is a Saturday at 11:59 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We will post the answers after this, and so the exam will not be reissued after Saturday, December 6th. So if you would like a certificate of participation, you'll need to attend 7 out of the live Zoom sessions or view the recordings through the learning platform and also take the final exam and pass with a score of 70% or higher. We are also happy to be able to offer nursing continuing education credits for the United States and or whoever else can obtain continuing education credits. They are available through the Alliance of Nurses for Healthy Environments platform, and one continuing education or credit or CE is available per individual webinar. So if you watch all of our 18 sessions, you will have 18 CEs at no charge. These are the dates that the password codes have been sent from the Global Consortium on Climate and Health Education email address if you watched at least 45 minutes or more of the live session. So we will send out a code. So when you go to the learning platform, you don't have to watch the video again. You can just enter in the code, take the 5-question quiz at the end, and also do the evaluation. Today's session will be 60 minutes in duration. It will end with a question and answer session. So please enter all of your questions into the Q&A and not into the chat, and we will be able to ask our speakers at the end of this session. And all of the resources will be available on our course website, and the QR code is available at the bottom right-hand side of your screen. And so now I would like to introduce our presenters today. We have two experts presenting to us today, and I will let you know a little bit about them. Our first speaker is Dr. Christina Kwauk, and she is co-founder and chief technical officer of the Unbound Alliance. She is a social scientist and policy analyst with an expertise on girls' education, 21st century skills, and youth empowerment at the intersections of gender, education, and climate change. Christina is the co-editor of Curriculum and Learning for Climate Action toward an SDG 4.7 roadmap for systems change and co-author of What Works in Girls' Education: Evidence for the World's Best Investment. She has published numerous policy papers, including the New Green Learning Agenda, Approaches to Quality Education for the Climate Empowerment. Christina is co-founder and chief technical officer of the Unbound Alliance. We also have our second speaker today, Leso Munala. Leso is a social worker, a PhD, and associate professor in the School of Nursing at the University of Minnesota. Her research investigates violence against women and girls through the intersectional lens, addressing systemic barriers, cultural norms, and institutional gaps in care. Her current work is in investigating the links between climate change and intimate partner violence in East Africa. It is my pleasure to welcome both Dr. Kwauk and Dr. Munala to our session today. And so with that, I will hand it over to you, Dr. Munala.
Good morning. Thank you for being here. As you have heard, our presentation today is on the critical and I think often overlooked link between climate change and gender-based violence. As you heard, my name is Dr. Munala, and I will be presenting the first half, laying the foundation on this issue. Next. Before we begin, a standard disclosure: we have no real or perceived vested interests related to this presentation. So I will start with a brief introduction to how climate change is manifesting. In small-scale communities, it is not a distant threat. It is experienced through frequent and extreme weather events. And these climate events are what create this harm pathway. So in terms of looking at specific areas, let's start with agriculture. So climate change has severe ramifications on all dimensions of food security. So food availability, food accessibility, food utilization, as well as system stability. And this is critically important because women are the backbone of food production in many regions. Women farmers account for 45 to 80% of all food production. In agrarian countries, about 2/3 of the female labor force in low and middle income countries. And they also account for over 90% in many African countries. Women are engaged in agricultural work. And so when climate disrupts agriculture, it disproportionately disrupts their lives as well as their livelihoods. Moving on to biodiversity. So climate change is a major driver for its loss. And this decline disproportionately impacts the poor. For example, declining fish populations hurt artisanal fishers. And when we think about deforestation, that means wood, which is still the most common solid fuel, fortunately or unfortunately, is now located much further from people's homes. And so this forces women and girls to search further for resources. And this is also a physically draining task that can take anywhere from 2 to 20 hours or more per week. So when we think about the increased travel, which is often alone and across long distances, that inherently increases their vulnerability to violence. The issue of water really is paramount. The burden of collecting water falls almost exclusively on women and girls. This is a UN statistic. Globally, women and girls spend an estimated 200 million hours every single day just collecting water in areas where potable water isn't available locally. And then the water they do manage to haul is rarely enough to meet household needs. And it's often contaminated, leading to a cascade of health issues that you are familiar with in your clinical practices. So in cases where arsenic contamination of groundwater is prominent, we've seen increased flood levels intensify the rate of exposure among rural people, as well as other social economically disadvantaged groups. And the resulting health problems from this arsenic contamination are like lesions, the hardening of skin, dark spots on feet and hands, swollen limbs, and loss of feeling. And this exposure can also have negative social repercussions. So we have talked about the health issues for arsenic poisoning victims, but the social repercussions is that it makes situations particularly worse for women who can be shunned or excluded or stigmatized based on their physical experience. And in some communities, impacts their ability to get married. And in those cases, many unmarried women are more vulnerable to poverty as well as social exclusion and violence. Next. So, in terms of natural disasters, when women do not have the same economic and social rights as women, more women than men die in disasters. And this gender discrepancy has come to light in a range of major disasters. The vulnerability of women to disasters is increased for a number of reasons. One, they really are at higher risk of being placed in unsafe, overcrowded shelters due to a lack of assets like savings or property or land. And they also could be cultural constraints on women's movement, which may hinder a timely escape from cyclones or floods. And what exacerbates this effect is that we have seen women often avoid using shelters altogether out of fear of physical and sexual violence. They even become less mobile because they're often the primary caregivers for children and the elderly. So when it's a natural disaster, they have a harder time moving as quickly as other people would. Next. So we have talked about agriculture, we have talked about biodiversity, we have talked about water, we have covered disasters, and all these pathways lead to a common devastating outcome, which is an increase in the risk of violence against women and girls. So how does this happen? Research has pointed to several key mechanisms. First, the breakdown of social structures and safety nets during climate crises leads to increased violence as people are competing for scarce resources, as you can imagine. And then second, we have seen cases where women and girls may be forced to migrate in search for food and work, making them vulnerable to sexual exploitation as well as trafficking. And then there's this level of desperation, particularly in agrarian economies where there's a loss of crop due to the extreme weather event. This desperation can force women and girls into transactional sex in order to provide for their families. And this increases their risk for HIV and AIDS as well as other STIs. And then finally, this pervasive stress from the loss of income and livelihood, particularly in agrarian communities, can aggravate and trigger intimate partner violence in the home. So let's make this connection even clearer with some specific examples from research, the research I have been involved in, as well as the broader field. So if we're thinking about agriculture, regarding agriculture and food security, when crops fail due to drought or floods, the resulting economic strain and food insecurity can increase household stress. So we see this directly translate into increased intimate partner violence as frustration over the inability to provide boils over in the home. If you're thinking about biodiversity, the decline in fish populations, which is a key natural resource, has led to the documented sex for fish practice, where women who rely on fishing for their livelihoods or to feed their families are coerced into transactional sex with fishermen in order to secure their catch for the day. In terms of water resources, as we have noted prior, women and girls spending millions of hours collecting water, and this long solitary journey to sometimes distant and isolated water sources dramatically increases their exposure to sexual assault and violence from predators who might know that they will be there alone. And then, as I mentioned, in natural disasters, in the aftermath of events like hurricanes or floods, women are often placed in overcrowded and unsafe temporary shelters. In these chaotic environments, they lack privacy and security and experience heightened risks of both sexual and physical attacks. So how does this happen systematically? So research has pointed to several key mechanisms. So each of the climate impacts I've just discussed funnels into one of these mechanisms. And this is what creates this perfect storm of risk for both women and girls, increasing their risk for violence. So based on previous research, which I'll mention in the next slide, my colleagues and I developed this conceptual framework for understanding the interlinkage between climate change, severe weather, and intimate partner violence. And we structured it around these three key components. The first one being climate stressors, the second one being gender inequalities and power dynamics, and the third one being the amplification of vulnerabilities. And these components are interconnected, they are mutually reinforcing, and they shape the experiences and vulnerabilities of women and girls in the context of climate change. Next, please. So I have established the theoretical pathways And what my colleagues and I wondered is if this is what we're actually seeing on the ground. Our previous research set out to answer this question using publicly available data across several East African agrarian economies. So we had analyzed the relationship between extreme weather events and reports of gender-based violence using DHS data. We looked at Zimbabwe, we looked at Uganda, we looked at Mozambique, and we looked at Kenya. And the findings from the publicly available data with MDOT data, which looks at weather events, were clear. Our results added to the body of evidence showing that this extreme weather can significantly increase women and girls' vulnerability to violence. So the data showed a measurable link. But population level data really only tells us that a link exists. It can't fully capture those lived experiences of women and girls. It doesn't tell us the how the violence or why it increases in people's own words. And so to bridge this gap, we designed this case study in Kilifi County, Kenya. So we moved from analyzing national data sets to listening directly to the community. So this qualitative study, which I'll present on this slide, really was built to answer this critical how and why questions, giving that human face and voice to the statistics. So this was a rigorous qualitative study designed to understand those issues from the community perspective. In the fall of 2023, we conducted 16 focus group discussions across key 5 demographic groups. So younger women, older women, adolescent girls, younger men and older men. And this allowed us to gather a wide range of viewpoints and experiences. And we also conducted key informant interviews with policymakers and community leaders and gender-focused organizations to understand the broader systemic context. And if you can see from the map, we collected data from both Ganze and Magarini, which is an agrarian community on the coast of Kenya. And one of the areas is prone to extended droughts. The other is prone to extreme flooding. And so we were able to have a good sort of comparison. In terms of our data analysis, we followed a robust qualitative methodology known as thematic analysis. This is where the entire research immerses themselves in the data, reading all the transcripts. We developed preliminary codes, which we then reviewed. We discussed and refined as a team to ensure consistency and accuracy. And we used the software in vivo to help us organize and manage the large amounts of qualitative data, allowing us to identify these key themes and patterns you'll see in the next slide. So now let's move into the heart of our findings from this Kilifi County. Our analysis revealed a clear and distressing pattern connecting climate stresses to violence. So we organized our results into 2 components that will structure the next slides. But first, the manifestation of violence. These are the specific types of violence that women and girls reported. So we look at sexual violence, transactional sex, early marriage, and physical violence. And second, the mechanisms of violence. So these are the underlying reasons why the violence increases. And this is according to the community. And the 3 primary drivers that were identified was the exacerbation of poverty, the loss of safe space, and increased stress at home. So this framework helps us move beyond just documenting the problem to understanding how it happens, which is essential for developing solutions. And so the first major manifestation is direct sexual violence. Climate change through extreme weather forces women and girls into vulnerable situations simply while they're performing essential tasks. So one adolescent girl from Ganze told us, where there is drought, there's a shortage of water. We have to go to the dams to fetch water, and it is very far. You might go alone and encounter someone who may rape you on the way. So for you as nurses, this sort of underscores that a patient reporting sexual assault may be a victim of a much larger environmental crisis. So their story isn't just about an individual perpetrator. It's also about a context of extreme weather that helped create those conditions for the attack. The next is transactional sex. On the next slide. Yes, thank you. Perhaps this is one of the most stark findings for us, which was the prevalence of transactional sex as a direct survival strategy. So economic desperation, which was driven by crop failure and poverty, forced women and girls to exchange sex for basic necessities. And what was interesting is men in the community were aware of this dynamic. As a younger man from Ganze stated, maybe the girl is an adolescent and the parent doesn't give her money even for pads, and this is menstrual pads. I will give her the money, but it won't be for free. And so this reframes what might be seen as a choice to get into transactional sex into what it truly is. It's a critical health risk which is taken under duress in order for these girls to meet fundamental needs. The next is early marriage. So in times of severe climate-induced hardships, girls become a commodity for survival. We have seen forced early marriages emerge as a desperate strategy for families to obtain food and money through dowry payments. One of the adolescent girls described the pressure by saying, when the drought is already there and there's no food at home, you are told to get married and you'll have to accept because you don't have a choice. And so the health implications are severe. Early pregnancy, as you know, means higher risk of obstetric complications. It means interrupted education. And then that leads to a lifelong economic disempowerment. And so this is another clear example of a public health crisis with roots in environmental disaster. Next is physical violence. So we have seen a documented increase in physical violence, primarily intimate partner violence within the home. As someone said, during drought, there is no food. And since there's no food, the husband will leave without giving you anything. Yet you have children there at home. When the husband comes back, he's highly intoxicated, and then he'll ask you what you have, yet he didn't leave you with anything. So then he starts the kicks and the blows and is now beating you. And so in a clinical setting, this means that there could be an increase in patients, particularly women, presenting with injuries which may coincide with, say, a period of drought or a period of flooding in your community, and it's just a pattern that we need to be aware of. So next we move to the mechanisms of violence. The first one is the exacerbation of poverty. So why does this happen? The primary mechanism really is the exacerbation of poverty that comes as a result of extreme weather events like drought and floods that really destroy livelihoods in this agrarian community. As one girl shared, there's a drought, parents fail to give girls money for important needs, so it compels girls like me to go to boys to get money to fulfill my needs. Now, if he gives me the money, he wouldn't want to give me for free. He wants me to pay with my body. And so this economic strain is the direct driver behind the manifestations we just saw. So it forces the girls into transactional sex for menstrual pads and foods. It pushes parents to marry off daughters to get a dowry to cover the crop loss. And so poverty really is the fuel of part of this crisis. The next mechanism is the loss of safe space. So the extreme weather events literally removes the physical environments where women and girls feel protected. So we have seen schools closed due to weather events because of flooding or because families can no longer afford school fees, which removes a critical safe haven for girls. We have seen also the girls' journey to collect water or firewood becoming longer and more dangerous, exposing them to potential assailants. As this participant shared, this woman shared, like during drought, there's low earnings. So people depend on cutting of trees in the forest, either for fuel or to sell. Isn't it so? You find a woman who has gone to the forest alone with a jerry can, with a machete, with an axe, and then unfortunately, a man emerges and rapes her, and there is no one to rescue her. And she cannot refuse because there's a machete. And so the last mechanism for increased violence is this increased stress at home. And this third mechanism operates at the household level. So dramatically increased stress at home is a result of the constant pressure of hunger or financial ruin from the loss of crops for the season. And this sort of helps create this tinderbox of frustration and desperation in the home. And this economic uncertainty that leads to that frustration and desperation at the family level leads to that conflict and strained relationship between family members. I think, as one woman shared, during drought, the earnings are low. Again, stress increases. The father comes home after walking outside in vain. Stress rises up. He wants to eat, but there's nothing. And it reaches a point where one small thing angers him, and he beats the wife and the children too. So compounding the situation, stresses at the family level also limit a woman's ability to leave abusive situation, because during extreme weather events, these financial burdens increase. So this vulnerability can place women in precarious circumstances as they frequently bear dual burdens of both escalating domestic tension as well as also the heightened household obligations to provide. So where do we go from here? The disproportionate gender impact of climate change really is becoming increasingly evident. The intensification of extreme weather events such as floods and droughts and hurricanes is directly affecting the lives of women and girls, and we have seen how then that leads to increased risk for gender-based violence. And so alongside clinical work, alongside community work, we must also push for change at a structural level through policy reform and adaptation. I think also the need to advocate for gender responsive climate action policies that are informed by, research findings. And this ensures that climate policies don't ignore gender, but work to actively protect women and girls and sort of include them in decision-making processes. And so this concludes the foundational part of the presentation. I will now hand it over to my esteemed colleague, Dr. Kwak, who will talk more about um, education as a solution to this climate crisis. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Munala. Excellent. Thank you. Thank you for proceeding forward. So now, before I jump into the crux of my presentation, I wanted to extend um, the points that Dr. Munala was expressing when it comes to, the gendered impacts of climate change on women and girls as well, and kind of extend that beyond the realms that she has provided us in order to ground us into this next portion of the discussion. And so as Dr. Munala expressed, women and men have vastly different and divergent access to financial resources, natural resources as well, land tenure, healthcare, decision-making power, and so on, which not only shapes the unequal impacts of climate change, but also the inequalities and the injustices that women and girls face in the context of that, one being the manifestation of gender-based violence and intimate partner violence, but also the responses that households make in the context of climate change. And so to extend that a little bit beyond some of the realms that Dr. Munala expressed, these also can be felt among women and young women and adolescent girls and girls in the context of their opportunity to gain essential skills and knowledge that can help build capacity and resilience. And so, for instance, we have good data that shows us that girls are more likely to be withdrawn from school or experience increased absenteeism during both protracted as well as sudden onset climate disasters because gender norms shape household coping responses that place lesser value on girls' education. Research shows that that this also can extend not only to girls being taken out of school, but also being forced into early marriage as child brides in order to ease the burden on scarce resources. And this came up earlier in Dr. Munala's presentation as well. We see this in contexts like Bangladesh. We've seen this in contexts in drought-ridden Sahel, where drought-induced famine is also leading, at least anecdotally, to more early and forced child marriage. During drought, we also have data that illustrates how gender norms dictate that, as Dr. Munala said, the responsibility of fetching water falls on girls and women, which has the impact on affecting girls' access to schooling, and so on. So we have really good evidence that shows that the realms in which girls and women experience the unequal impacts also extend into education. And it's with that understanding that we also have to understand that we also have to think about, how might we address some of these unequal impacts? How might we begin thinking about solutions to reducing not only the incidence of gender-based violence, especially in the context of climate change, but also their risk as climate change worsens around the world? Next slide, please. And so the core of my presentation is really how do we begin thinking about education as a climate solution? Oftentimes, those of us who advocate for education, we do so on the basis that education isn't just a basic social service, but that it is a basic human right. And when we talk about its importance as a pathway out of poverty or as an essential component of society, or human capital, for example, that's needed for economic growth, prosperity, human flourishing, and so on, what we oftentimes miss is thinking about the foundational role of education as a climate solution. And so this is where my presentation today will kind of help us begin to see how we might begin to address gender-based violence in the context of climate change. Next slide, please. And so when we think about education as a climate solution, we can think about it in three ways. And so this first sort of pathway is universal education, where every child receives 12 years of quality education. And why is that important? Because education is the strongest predictor of adaptive capacity. And if we see increased rates of adaptive capacity, we also see increased agency, increased empowerment, and the ability to be able to address some of these unequal impacts of climate change. Next slide, please. In particular, this impact largely boils down to two pathways. One is a direct pathway and one is an indirect pathway. The direct effect of education on climate resilience and adaptive capacity comes through sort of the things that we understand education does, right? It enhances cognitive development, it builds skills, it strengthens capacities. It also helps to create behavioral change and pathways for more informed decision making, right? So some of these are the more direct things that we think about when it comes to education as an essential ingredient to resilience and adaptation. The indirect effects also are critical for thinking how we might begin to address, these heightened rates of and risk of gender-based violence. And one is that it addresses some of those mechanisms that Dr. Munala just spoke about. It reduces extreme poverty. It improves health. It increases perceived risk or our ability to perceive risk and to therefore reduce that risk by taking the appropriate measures to plan and respond. Through risk reduction or migration, the adoption of new practices or behaviors or technologies, and so on. Education also helps to allow us to become more flexible in terms of our ability to learn new skills, to take on new jobs, to find new livelihoods. And this diversification of our capacities and our income potential helps communities and individuals and households become less dependent on climate sensitive sectors that were very clear in Dr. Munala's presentation. And again, another indirect pathway is through the enhanced agency that education enables in the face of climate crisis, in the face of other crises as well, opening up options to respond and to adapt to the impacts of whatever that shock or stressor might be. And so here, the bottom line is that universal education is key to reducing vulnerability to disasters by building resilience and adaptive capacity. Higher levels of education, especially upper secondary and tertiary levels, is associated with higher levels of adaptive capacity. And this effect has been observed at a much greater level for women than for men. Next slide, please. But we are a far cry away from achieving universal education. The latest estimates suggest that 250 million children, of which 122 million, or 250 million children, of which 122 million are girls, are not in school. And they are mostly concentrated in low-income country contexts. There are high rates of learning poverty as well, and which measures the share of children who cannot read a simple text with comprehension by the age of 10, even though they might actually be in school. So the World Bank estimates that after COVID, 70% of children in low and middle income country contexts live in learning poverty, and 86% of those children live in sub-Saharan Africa. So even though children may be in school, they may not be learning because the quality of that education is not good. So this has, great implications beyond just the education, but thinking again about that opportunity for building resilience, building adaptive capacity. Next slide, please. The second pathway for thinking about education as a climate solution is girls' education. So already, as I mentioned earlier, a key challenge to achieving universal education is that persisting gender inequalities, especially in low and middle income countries, poses enormous barriers to education for half of our population. But we have great research that shows that girls' education itself is a powerful determinant of adaptive capacity and resilience at the country level. Remember, I mentioned that the effects of higher levels of education on adaptive capacity is higher for women than for men. And much of this has been premised on studies that look at the years of schooling among girls and women. The impact could be even greater if we begin to look at the quality of schooling for girls and boys. Next slide, please. When we talk about girls' education as a climate solution, we can think about it as providing itself three distinct pathways to impact. One of those is around sexual reproductive health and rights, where increased education and especially increased comprehensive sexuality education includes a rights-based approach to sexual reproductive health and rights, increases bodily autonomy and agency over reproductive choices, which is critical in the context of increased and heightened vulnerability and risk to things like gender-based violence and so on. The second sort of key pathway for girls' education too is around leadership, where we have great research that shows us that education for girls provides important leadership development opportunities and pathways to formal positions of leadership and decision making, whether that be at the community level or at the country level. And when it is at the country level, we see that countries with greater female representation in parliament and have greater levels of political empowerment have lower carbon footprints. Those countries have stricter climate policies. They have more protected land areas and marine areas, and they have other really great pro-environmental outcomes at a country level. And then the third pathway is thinking about the skills that an investment in girls' education can provide, and especially increased green skills that allow for enhanced participation by women in their increased participation in green sectors, the green economy, in livelihoods that help to promote the transition to low carbon development pathways. So when we think about girls' education as a solution, it's a quite powerful mechanism, not only when it comes to thinking about our transitions to greener societies, but to reducing the potential risk and vulnerability to the gender-based violence and the gendered impacts of climate change as well. Next slide, please. So while we have three very powerful reasons to invest in girls' education as a climate solution, unfortunately, especially in the world's most climate vulnerable countries, the education of millions of girls annually is at risk of disruption due to climate events. Again, pointing back to Dr. Munala's presentation earlier. And climate change disrupts girls' education through direct and indirect channels. Direct channels are things like the actual destruction and damage to school infrastructure or the pathways and the roads to school, degraded learning environments because of rising temperatures and excessive heat that make it impossible to learn and make it difficult to be ready to learn. Also thinking about the stress on water and sanitation and hygiene infrastructure at schools due to drought or flooding or destroyed infrastructure. And this has implications especially for menstruating learners and teachers. And then those indirect mechanisms as well that I won't go into too much detail because we've already talked about a lot of that with deteriorated livelihoods, increased deprivation, and negative household coping responses, and so on. All right, so we have a lot of challenges here. Next slide, please. And then finally, the third sort of pathway for thinking about education as a climate solution is around climate education itself. And this is not just thinking, again, about any kind of education, but really thinking about how do we increase the knowledge and awareness among girls and boys around the associated risks that climate change has on their communities and how they can, and understanding what climate change is in general, so that they and their communities can better plan and respond, adapt, and cope to these climate-related disasters. And as a result, have strengthened adaptive capacity, strengthened climate resilience, and reduce that exposure and vulnerability to gender-based violence. Next slide, please. Typically, when we think about, in the context of our current climate crises, we think about the emissions gap. We think about how much we need to reduce that gap, where our countries, the trajectories that our countries are currently taking when it comes to our levels of emissions and where they need to be reduced to. The same needs to go with the education gap. This is something that critically, especially in countries that have heightened rates of vulnerability, heightened risk to climate hazards, heightened gender inequality and gender-based violence, these education gaps are critical to, again, increasing adaptive capacity and resilience. Next slide, please. And so here, I just wanted to throw out some important statistics that show us how closing the education gap is critical, not only for reducing risk of gender-based violence and the gendered unequal impacts of climate change, but also thinking about how it can essentially help our societies, again, with the knowledge and the awareness about climate change and the skills that are necessary to really address those potential livelihood impacts. Uh, I realize we're almost out of time, so I just want to go to the next slide and then wrap up for us. But we do have quite a lot of barriers when it comes to even getting to climate education. A few years ago, we analyzed nationally determined contributions of 140 countries to the or parties to the UNFCCC, and very few, less than a third of countries, climate strategies are calling for climate change education. And very few countries' national curricular frameworks are, integrating climate change and climate learning. And this is despite a large majority of young people around the world demanding that they learn climate change, yet not having sufficient education to be able to even explain what climate change is, and so on. So we have a lot of barriers. And the last slide of mine, if you want to go it forward, is really thinking about those barriers to adoption, because we understand, again, from a research perspective and the data, that education is a powerful solution, not only to addressing the climate crisis, but really to ensuring that girls and women have the skills, have the capacities, have the agency and the leadership to be able to reduce their vulnerability to gender-based violence. Next slide, please. And some of those barriers is, at the policy level. When we think about, as I said before, our climate policies are not looking at this intersection. A World Bank study just recently found that 62% of policymakers in 33 low and middle income countries said that protecting learning from climate change is among the bottom 3 priorities for their country. So they're not thinking about how do we enhance adaptive capacity and address some of these gender unequal impacts of climate change through things like education. And I already mentioned that national climate strategies are also not attending to this. When it comes to funding, the education sector experiences a $75 billion annual shortfall when it comes to being able to adequately resource national education systems around the world. And there's been research that suggests that if regions like countries in Africa continue their current pace of educational investment, it will take 100 years to reach universal primary education. And I already mentioned how important that universal primary education is to increasing adaptive capacity. And if we are not, making those investments, we are essentially hamstringing our societies from being able to respond in ways that promote justice and equity, especially for girls and women. And then again, mindsets and values, and really thinking about how our existing systems of patriarchy, in many ways, prevent us from responding, thinking, and being and doing differently in the context of climate, right? And thinking about how those negative household coping responses leads households to take action that is at the detriment of women and girls. So we have a lot of barriers to adoption, but we know that investing in education, and especially for girls and women, is critical to reducing their risk of gender-based violence and reducing the negative impacts that they experience of climate change. So we have a lot of work to do, and I want to close there with both, positive thinking in terms of what our solutions might be, but also some realistic thinking for thinking about what we need to do at the policy level and at our community level to make it happen. So thank you so much. And I think I'll turn it back over to Gina.
Thank you so much to Dr. Munala and Dr. Kwauk for that just amazing presentation. And you really have given us a lot to think about, and there are a lot of questions. So I hope we can at least get to a few of them in our remaining time. So thank you so much. I think this question, either one of you can respond to it. So I will ask this. Gender violence is prevalent regardless of disasters. Is there anything being done to educate and change the behavior of boys and men? I know we spoke a lot about what girls can do, but so if whoever would like to respond to that.
I think that's where education comes in. And I think Dr. Kwauk very eloquently talked about that. So I'll let you take that question. But I think also education or educating, boys and men on um, the different aspects of prevention of violence. And this is where like the educational system is very important as one of the key ways or solutions around climate change.
Christina, can you?
Sorry. Yes, I forgot to come off mute. Absolutely. And I just to echo what Dr. Munala said, I mean, our current frameworks, especially as global actors in the education space become more aware of climate change and the impact that climate change has on countries' capacities to even meet basic education needs, they're starting to recognize that if we're not also addressing these deeper systemic injustices through education, we can't address climate change and the impacts of climate change on education. So more and more countries are becoming aware of the need to think about climate education, education more broadly, from an intersectional approach, thinking about how gender equality, how climate justice, how poverty eradication are all intertwined in what we need to achieve through our education systems. But I think a key piece of that is, how do we resource our education systems to deliver that kind of education? How do we ensure that all children within the education system are learning about gender inequality and the gendered impacts of climate change? Because that is certainly an aspiration. But if we don't have the resources to allow our education systems to do that, we're going to continue to see this cycle of these unequal impacts for girls and women. And boys and men certainly have a role to play to help shift those mindsets and the negative coping responses that happen. Thanks.
Thank you for that. We have another question. How can we reduce gender-based violence as a matter of impact of climate change other than strengthening governance? Whoever would like to.
Other than strengthening what?
Governance.
Governance. One of the papers that we are working on, hopefully to be published soon, is on community level interventions. People talked about wanting to be able to feel empowered to have those opportunities to make the changes they need to make in their communities. They talked about just having education protected so that they have different ways to earn income that are not reliant solely on agriculture. My research has been primarily in agrarian economies, and one of the reasons I even we looked at the connection between climate change and gender-based violence was that usually agriculture was the solution to gender-based violence cases. Like they would talk about, just empower the women, give them a bunch of land or animals to take care of, and that's a way to get them out of poverty, to get them out of violence. And so if the solution is now a risk due to climate change through extreme weather events, then we have to think of another way that that keeps the girls in this context, for example, in school, or gives them a different way to earn a living that is not at risk of an extreme weather event.
Thank you. They could become nurses like all of us. And social workers, right? Okay. Gosh, I wish we had time. We are at our really last minute, but I just want to leave the participants today and the viewers. Is there any one policy or system level action that could make the greatest difference in reducing gender-based violence linked to climate change? And what would it be? And how can nurses' voices help to advance it in our last minute?
Hmm. Maybe I'll jump in, Leso, and then you can respond. I'm not a nurse, I'm not in the health profession, but I feel like nurses have a wonderful access to caregivers who are in a position to receive information in ways that in other spaces they are not. And so if I could think of like one thing that nurses in the nursing profession could do is to really reiterate the importance of the value of girls' education, the value of education in general, and really kind of using that as an entryway for spreading sort of the message that education is a critical pathway towards resilience and adaptive capacity. And the more we can convey that message to caregivers who, when they, if they find themselves in a position of desperation after a climate shock, they still know and they're making decisions based on the idea that education is important. I have to keep my kids in school. What can I do to ensure that that happens? So that would be my sort of one thing. But Dr. Munala, you probably have a lot of others.
I think very quickly when we're thinking about reporting, if they present in the clinical setting, I think also talking about the larger context that the a sexual assault happened, particularly if it's connected to droughts or flooding, just talking about the larger context of extreme weather and the conditions that promoted or exacerbated the violence in that community is also helpful in documenting the harms that extreme weather has in the increasing the risk of violence against women and girls.
Thank you both so much. Immense gratitude for sharing this with all of us